"You lack fundamental leadership qualities," Marcus Reed had said, and he'd said it with the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who's convinced himself that his assessment of you is objective fact rather than personal opinion. We were in his apartment, having what I thought was going to be a conversation about our future together, and instead it became a conversation about my fundamental inadequacy. I wasn't assertive enough. I was too willing to defer to others. I didn't have the kind of commanding presence that real leaders possessed. I would always be someone's subordinate rather than someone's leader. He'd said all of this while looking at me with something that might have been pity, and I'd listened because I was 28 years old and I believed him, because I was in love with him, because I'd constructed enough self-doubt that his assessment felt like truth rather than cruelty. Yet the twist came not from his dismissal itself, which was devastating but predictable in retrospect, but from the fact that 15 years later, after I'd rebuilt myself and climbed the ranks of the biotech industry and eventually become the chief executive officer of Mercer-Taxis Pharmaceuticals, one of the most powerful positions in pharmaceutical development, I would receive notice that my company was acquiring Marcus's employer, which meant he would be reporting to me, which meant I would finally have the opportunity to show him exactly what I'd learned about leadership in the years since he'd decided I was fundamentally incapable of it. What would Marcus's face show when he understood who his new boss actually was? My name is Dr. Estelle Morrison, and I have spent the last 15 years learning that the people who dismiss your potential are almost always the people most surprised by your actual achievement. I met Marcus Reed at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He was charming in a way that suggested he'd spent time perfecting his charm. The kind of person who could convince you that his confidence was confidence rather than arrogance, that his certainty about things was based on actual knowledge rather than intellectual laziness. I was there because I'd always wanted to understand how the human body actually worked, and I'd spent my entire life reading everything I could get my hands on about molecular biology and cellular structure. We dated for 3 years, and during that time, Marcus became increasingly convinced that our relationship should be the organizing principle of my life. He didn't want me to do research. He didn't want me to pursue a medical degree. He wanted me to be supportive of his ambitions, which were significant. He was going to be a surgeon, he was going to be excellent, and he needed a partner who understood that his career had to come first. I'd agreed to that for a while. I'd deferred my own plans. I'd supported his educational goals. I'd made his ambitions the centerpiece of my support system. And then I'd realized that I was disappearing. So I'd broken up with him, and I'd told him the truth. I needed to pursue my own ambitions. I needed to finish medical school. I needed to do research. I needed to stop making myself smaller so that he could feel larger. That's when he'd delivered the assessment about my fundamental lack of leadership qualities. He'd said it because he was hurt, because my refusal to organize my entire life around his ambitions felt like betrayal, because he couldn't conceive of a world in which I could actually succeed without him believing in me. I'd walked out of his apartment, and I'd never gone back. The next 15 years were not a linear path to success. They were complicated, difficult, and genuinely uncertain at multiple points. I finished medical school. I specialized in pharmaceutical research and development. I took positions at increasingly prominent biotech companies. I published papers. I attended conferences. I built a reputation for being brilliant but difficult to work with. I had opinions, and I wasn't shy about expressing them, and I didn't care particularly about political hierarchies or the social niceties that kept corporate environments functioning smoothly. By 2025, when I was 43 years old, I'd become the chief research officer at Mercer-Taxis Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the United States. The position gave me significant authority over all development operations. I reported directly to the CEO, and I had a board seat. The CEO, James Patterson, was approaching 70 and had mentioned that he was considering retirement. There had been discussion about my succession. There had been board meetings where my name was mentioned. There had been quiet confirmation from several board members that I was the frontrunner for the position. And then James had suddenly announced his retirement, and I'd been offered the CEO position, and I'd accepted. At 43 years old, I was the chief executive officer of Mercer-Taxis Pharmaceuticals, running a company with annual revenue of approximately $8.2 billion and annual research budgets exceeding $1.2 billion. Marcus, I would later learn, was still in clinical medicine. He'd become a surgeon, as he'd always planned. But his career trajectory had plateaued around 15 years ago. He'd never made the jump to administration. He'd never moved into hospital leadership. He'd remained essentially a very good surgeon working in a mid-tier hospital system, convinced that his surgical skills were his entire value proposition. I didn't think about him much. He was part of my past, a cautionary tale about what happens when you allow other people to define your limitations. Then I received a call from my chief operating officer, Victoria Park. "I wanted to give you a heads up," she said. "We're considering acquiring Hartwell Medical Systems. It's a smaller company, but they have some interesting IP in cardiac device development that could complement our existing portfolio." "Why?" I asked. "We don't need more IP. We need better execution. The acquisition would give us access to their manufacturing infrastructure," Victoria explained. "They have facilities in 3 states that are already set up for the kind of production we need. Buying them would be faster than building new facilities ourselves." "Is the company financially healthy?" I asked. "Not particularly," Victoria said. "They've had leadership problems. The CEO before the current one was essentially a figurehead. The company drifted for a few years. But the new CEO seems to be trying to turn things around. Still, they're looking at potential acquisition because they're not confident they can survive independently." "Who's the CEO?" I asked. "Man named Thomas Caldwell," Victoria said. "Former surgeon, moved into hospital administration about 10 years ago." "Not Marcus Reed," Victoria continued, reading from her notes, "but there's a chief medical officer at Hartwell named Marcus Reed. Apparently very well respected in the cardiac surgery community, but the company brought him in as an administrator about 2 years ago. He's been helping with the turnaround effort." I didn't respond immediately. I was processing the coincidence, trying to understand what the universe was actually doing. "Did you want me to arrange for you to meet him?" Victoria asked. "The CMO, I mean. He's apparently one of the key people in their decision-making." "No," I said. "I don't need to meet him. Let's proceed with the acquisition. I'll handle the integration planning with Hartwell's leadership once the deal is final." The acquisition was announced 6 weeks later. Mercer-Taxis was acquiring Hartwell Medical Systems for $340 million, which was a reasonable price given their financial situation and their IP portfolio. The integration would take place over the next 18 months, with Hartwell's leadership team reporting into the Mercer-Taxis structure. Marcus would report directly to me. He would have no choice in the matter. The acquisition meant that his employer was now my company. His CEO, Thomas Caldwell, would stay on for another year, but in a diminished capacity. The other executives would be integrated into the Mercer-Taxis hierarchy. And Marcus, as chief medical officer, would report into my office as the chief executive officer. The first time I saw him after the acquisition was finalized was at the integration meeting. All of Hartwell's leadership team was in the conference room, and I was facilitating the conversation about how the 2 companies' operations would merge. Marcus walked in, and I watched the moment of recognition happen on his face. I watched him understand who I was. I watched him process the fact that the woman he'd dismissed as fundamentally incapable of leadership was now his boss. His face went pale. I pretended not to notice. I conducted the meeting professionally. I outlined the integration strategy. I explained how the 2 companies' research divisions would combine. I answered questions. I was perfectly, impeccably professional. And I watched Marcus sit there, understanding exactly what had happened, unable to do anything about it. After the meeting ended, Marcus stayed behind. "Estelle," he said, and his voice had changed. It was smaller somehow. "I didn't realize. I knew you were successful, but I didn't realize you were. The CEO of your new parent company?" I finished for him. "Yes, I am. I wanted to apologize," he said, "for what I said. Back when we were together. I was wrong. I was young and stupid and afraid that you'd surpass me, so I tried to diminish you. I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked older than I remembered. He looked like someone who'd spent 15 years convinced that he'd made the right choice, and who'd just discovered that the choice had been catastrophically wrong. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he repeated. "You apologized," I said. "I accept the apology. Now let's focus on the integration. I need you to prepare a comprehensive report on Hartwell's cardiac device development program. I need it by Friday." "Of course," he said quickly. "I'll get that to you." What happened over the next 18 months was nothing dramatic. There was no revenge fantasy, no public humiliation, no moment where I reminded him of what he'd said all those years ago. What actually happened was that Marcus discovered what it meant to work for someone who had both power and competence. He discovered that I made decisions based on data rather than ego. He discovered that I was willing to listen to his medical expertise while also being absolutely uninterested in his personal opinions about my leadership capabilities. He was a good chief medical officer, actually. He understood cardiac device development. He had relationships in the medical community. He could talk to surgeons in ways that I, as a researcher rather than a clinician, could not. And I utilized those capabilities while making it absolutely clear that I was the one in charge. Within a year, he'd asked to transfer to a different role. He wanted to return to more clinical work. He didn't feel suited to the executive environment anymore. He requested a position in clinical research rather than administration. I approved the transfer. He moved into the clinical research division, where he reported to a director who reported to me, and where he could do work he was actually passionate about without having to navigate the executive hierarchy. It was, I think, the most generous thing I could have done for him. I was giving him an exit from a position where he was fundamentally uncomfortable, where he was constantly reminded of his incorrect assessment of me, where every day was likely a demonstration of how wrong he'd been. 7 years after the Hartwell acquisition, Mercer-Taxis Pharmaceuticals had become the second-largest pharmaceutical company in the United States, with annual revenue exceeding $12 billion. I'd led 3 major drug approvals through the FDA, including a breakthrough treatment for heart failure that had saved thousands of lives. I'd been named to multiple most powerful people in pharmaceutical development lists. I'd been invited to speak at medical conferences and business schools. And I'd been completely unremarkable in my treatment of Marcus Reed. He remained with the company, working in clinical research, contributing meaningful work without ever again trying to climb into administration. We would cross paths occasionally at company events. We were always professional. We were never cold, but we were never warm either. 3 years ago, at a company holiday party, I'd seen him with a woman I didn't recognize. She was introducing herself to people and explaining that she was Marcus's wife and that they'd just gotten married. He looked happy in a way I don't think I'd ever seen him look before, genuinely content rather than performing confidence. I'd congratulated them both, and I'd meant it, because what I'd learned over 15 years wasn't how to hate Marcus or how to punish him for his assessment of me. What I'd learned was that the best response to someone's dismissal of your potential is to build something so undeniably significant that their original assessment becomes not just wrong but irrelevant. When Marcus had told me I lacked leadership qualities, he'd been looking at me from the perspective of someone who needed me to be small. He couldn't imagine that I could be powerful because my power threatened something in him. By the time I actually became powerful, by the time I ran his industry and his company and his career, he'd had so many years to reconsider his original assessment that the vindication almost didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I knew the truth. What mattered was that I'd built a life that didn't require anyone's validation. What mattered was that I'd become the kind of leader he'd said I could never be, and I'd done it not to prove him wrong, but because leadership was who I actually was. The subordinate he'd predicted I'd always be? She never actually existed. She was just what he needed to see in order to maintain his own sense of superiority. The real me, the one who was there all along, just needed the space and time to emerge. And once I had that space, once I had that time, there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop me.